Hi everybody. Don't stop getting food. That's one of the main things that we supply here. But my name is David Wilkins. I am the director of the now Center for the Legal Profession. For those of you paying attention since last year, we've actually had a status upgrade. Along with the iPhone 6, we're new and improved, slightly larger, hopefully faster and more nimble. But one of the things that we are continuing, and hopefully to continue to improve, is this Speaker Series. And we hope to be with you pretty much every Tuesday or almost every Tuesday at this time. So please watch this space. We'd also like to let you know about other events. So they're somewhere around here. I think there's a sign-up sheet if you want to find out about conferences or other kinds of talks. We have a lot of interesting things planned throughout the year, and one of our main objectives is to really connect students here and really all over the university with some of the exciting things that are happening out of the world. As many of you know, we have a lot of interesting research projects, including a project on globalization, lawyers, and emerging economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it, after the popular TV show, which is where we got to meet, and I got to meet particularly our terrific speakers today, who are going to talk about one of the most interesting, in every sense of the word, I think Bharat will say, countries in the world, and of course that's India, which is undergoing a tremendous amount of transition, and particularly after the new election, and particularly around issues of M&A and corporate law. And we are really delighted to have two terrific lawyers from one of the very top law firms in India, which has really been a great partner with us on some of the research that we've done on India, and who has contributed to many things here at Harvard, including coming to our Leadership in Law Firms course, which is how I met Bharat. So he's actually my student, so I'll be here grading him to see how he does. But in any event, Bharat Anand is a partner at Khaitan and Company since 2009. He really is really energized and kicked off their M&A practice, particularly in Delhi, which now has been ranked #1 by the various rating services. He's had a long and distinguished career, including working at Freshfields for a while. So I just talked to one of my favorite students who is going to Freshfields. Maybe you could give her a clue about that. And he's brought along Rishi Shroff, who's an associate at Khaitan and Company since 2013. He's worked on a number of projects in capital markets and M&A, but also is very engaged in pro bono. So some of you may be interested in what the future of pro bono in India. But our goal is for not to have me talk, but to have them talk. So they've agreed they'll talk for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then that hopefully will leave lots of time for your questions. So, Bharat, thank you so much for coming.
Great. Thanks a ton, David. It's great to be here, and thank you all for coming to this this talk. And it's nice weather outside, at least it was in the morning when we walked down. So I really appreciate your spending your time here rather than enjoying the good weather outside. So just quickly by way of overview, we'll spend some time talking about a case study which actually exemplifies how corporate India works in many ways. We've chosen a transaction which is really a hostile M&A deal. But only because there are so few of them. And the idea really was to illustrate, some of the nuances of India and really the Indian corporate scene by means of this particular case study. But before we really jump into the case study, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what's been happening in India. So circa 2006, 2007, India couldn't make a wrong move. It was one of the darlings of the investors all over the world, and very often I was at Freshfields at the time, and very often we refer to this chart, which was India zooming along and catching up with the US at some stage, or at least certainly beating some of the European developed nations. And I don't know whether you guys have watched the movie Rush, but this kind of graphic illustrates that chase. And then, India during that period did quite well. We had about 8% GDP growth, sustained GDP growth for about 10 years. And there was talk in 2008, 2009 about India actually decoupling from some of the global recessionary headwinds that were hitting the West, and that was obviously very positive for people like me, because I had moved back to India, in 2009, and there was a huge degree of optimism, in the country. And then, of course, people were talking about the elephant awakens, but then suddenly awakens to what? Awakens to a large slide, because if you look at what happened to India from about middle of 2010 onwards, there was a huge slump in terms of GDP growth numbers, in terms of FDI, and that's quite interesting, because if you start peeling the onion and start asking, why did that slump take place? It was actually a tremendous loss of confidence. A tremendous loss of confidence in terms of the existing establishment. Media, social media in particular, played a huge role in terms of, bringing up challenges. There were a number of corporate scams, and with that, I'll just move on to the slide. So with that, you had a slowdown. You had a huge slowdown of investment, with investment slowing down, I think essentially, if you examine India at that point in time, you saw that you had negative interest rates, you had high levels of inflation, and the levels of interest rates on things like corporate deposits, etc., were actually much lower than real inflation. And having that kind of an environment, having an environment where you had negative interest rates, actually forced people to move away from keeping cash in banks. And with this sort of crunch of liquidity that hit India, the rate of interest for corporates to borrow shot up. So we were doing deals sitting in Khaitan. We were doing refinancing transactions where people in sectors like real estate, financial services were borrowing at 20-25% in order to stay afloat. And this extremely high cost of capital, high inflation, essentially resulted in investment levels and corporate investment levels falling significantly, and that had a knock-on effect on the ability of the economy to grow in the usual course, and to sustain itself in the usual course. So you see an environment now in India where again, in terms of, if you look at some of the statistics that we've got there, investment rates in terms of savings, etc., are still quite high. The economy is still saving around 40 to 42%, and the capital output ratio in the economy is also quite high. But what's happened is that people, because of the insecurity, people have moved away from investing in terms of deposits, have actually moved away into investing in areas like gold, areas like real estate, and that investable corpus that the economy really needs to move forward, that has dried up, that liquidity has dried up, and a part of that drying up of liquidity has actually resulted in India's growth slumping. So India's Prime Minister is here next week, and part of the challenges that he faces are really fundamental challenges of bringing confidence back into India, so that people start moving away from their love for gold, their love for illiquid assets like real estate, bringing down inflation. Huge cause of high inflation in India are structural bottlenecks. India lacks the infrastructure, lacks the ability to actually bring people together and products together. So there's huge demand-supply gaps and huge inflation. And so these are multiplicity of challenges that that exist in India, and that the current government will have to deal with. So in that. So while that story was bubbling along, while you had, it was difficult for the likes of GE or other large infrastructure players to actually go out there and make large billion-dollar investments and do large deals and build roads and build highways and build the storage that you need to develop the infrastructure. You had a slightly separate story carrying on, and we saw it on the deal scene as well. Consumer spending in India did reasonably well. People had cash, and that cash was distributed and dispersed all over the economy. So you had people, coming in right from, buying, Kellogg's cornflakes to buying, products made by people like Confetti, Coke. Companies like this did really well. And if you look at some of the statistics that we've got, up there, this was a report by BCG, which, talks about consumer spending in India growing, growing at the rate of 3.6 times, from about 991 billion to 3.6 trillion in 2020. And now in India, all these numbers that come out are always large, right? I mean, they're always sort of shocking numbers. You had 500 million people vote and things like that. But certainly that was a trend that you witnessed. You had slowing down of infrastructure, high inflation, structural bottlenecks, drying up of liquidity, but then people had some cash in their pocket. And when they had cash in their pocket, they were going to spend it. They did not have the large, big ticket infrastructure projects which were keeping them employed, but certainly they wanted their mobile phones, they wanted entertainment, they wanted Coke, they wanted garments, footwear. Those kinds of industries did reasonably well. And I think it's in that context that we bring to you this case study that we're going to talk about. It's really represents a consumer industry. It's the entertainment industry, the media and entertainment industry. It was an industry which many people thought was quite lucrative. And as I said, this example of the Inox-Fame transaction really exemplifies how some aspects of the India's securities markets work, some peculiarities, and hopefully you find it interesting and there's some interesting discussion around it. So.
So thanks, Bharat. So basically, what we thought we'd do is, before we move into the Inox-Fame transaction, which we've studied at more detail, but I thought we'd give you an overview of the Indian securities environment and what the law really is. And we thought we'd do it with a case study. So this is a really old example, which is often described as the first real hostile takeover attempt in India. So basically what happened was, quickly the facts, India came up with a policy in 1982 to encourage investment, right? So what it did was, it said that we get non-Indians or Indians who've lived abroad, send in money to India. And so there's this guy, Swaraj Paul. He's an Indian who's based out of England. And what he suggested was, he pumped in a lot of money into two companies, a company called DCM and a company called Escorts. So we picked up the DCM example. Now, the peculiar thing is that the policy allowed investment up to 5% with a view, to protect Indian firms and to not allow more than 5% from a non-Indian or from an Indian abroad. And he managed to shore up about 13.5%. Now, what that resulted in was his shareholding went above the promoter. So the Indian controlling shareholders, the family normally who controls the company, who started the company, are referred to as promoters in Indian law. So the promoter family, the DCM family, only owned 9%. Now what that did was, he was 13 and that was 9, right? And there was suddenly an absolute perfect situation where he could have a hostile takeover and he could really, so DCM obviously didn't want to lose control, and the family approached the courts. Court said there's absolutely nothing wrong with what he's done. He shored it up in absolutely legitimate ways. And the irony with the whole transaction was, that finally he had to use the DCM family used their good offices, went to the Prime Minister, and suddenly Swaraj Paul left and there was nothing that could be done, right? So there's just an introduction to, like our heading, so the old boys club, right? So there was this dependence on protecting your investment and ensuring it by hook or crook that you will remain in control of your company. So that's just the first one. So that leads us to the other aspect, which is very applicable even today, which is how are Indian companies held, right? So the ownership structures. So there lots of research has gone into what are the top listed companies in India and who really owns them, right? So unlike the US or anywhere in the West where there's a very fragmented ownership, Indian companies are really held by promoter families or controlling shareholders. And that's a peculiarity which has widespread implications on all the deals, including hostile takeovers and how they operate. So just a quick study, so 6,000 odd listed companies, of which about 1,500 were surveyed. And interestingly, in those companies, more than 57% were held by those controlling shareholders. So single individuals or individuals of a family, close relatives, together held enough to control the day-to-day management, right? So now the implications of that on a structure and on an attempt to take over is significant, because what it means is that as much as you want to have a deal and a takeover attempt, there's no way that you can shore up 100%, right? And therefore that has an impediment on the way boards are structured as well. So this causes the Indian company boards to have independent directors and directors who are basically just operate on what these promoters expect and what they want, right? So again, the same survey went on to look at independent directors on such companies, which are India's top listed companies, and they found that these independent directors actually were advisors to the promoter group or to the controlling shareholders, and not really did not see themselves as checks and balances on how the company is operating, right? So that's absolutely shocking, because that takes away from the whole structure of how governance ought to be in. So that's just a flavor of the first takeover, hostile attempt, and also the ownership structures, which will lead us into our transaction. Which,
okay, thanks, Rishi. So very quickly, there you go. They're taking over the sign in Hollywood as well. So okay, so the cast. And again, you'll forgive me, I have to refer to my notes, but so Fame was set up by a guy called Shroff, and he was quintessential sort of second or third generation family business. So he's Western educated, he got his MBA from Melbourne, he's worked abroad, and then he comes back, and obviously he wants to do something which is not conventional business, something appealing, something which is quite snazzy, and he picks up this idea that, look, in India, in the multiplex space, there is a lot of room. There is room for improvement. There is, room for growth, and he establishes 95 screens in 12 cities, and he does that over a fairly short period of time. Obviously, he needs financing for that. He doesn't have the equity, so India had issued this particular regulation which allowed you to go ahead and raise money offshore, and you had listed bonds. And those listed bonds were quite often subscribed to at a premium for the current listed price, but then were redeemed either into, automatically converted into equity and therefore resulted in dilution, or you could redeem them at coupon plus face value. And Fame issued these FCCBs to foreign investors at a very high premium to market price. Go back to the decoupling that we described, the 8% consistent growth for almost a decade. And that, created this huge premium in the price, but of course, at some time they had to be redeemed, and obviously the clock somewhere was ticking. So that's the background to the target. You then had Inox, a very different group in many ways. Conventional group set up, 1947 or in the 1940s. A group, one of the few groups I would say in India that has actually learned to partner with Western business and has done a number of successful joint ventures which are intact even today. Entered the cinema business in 1999. They made a lot of money in their gas business, and one of the few Indian companies to actually make money out of carbon credits. And a lot of that excess surplus cash had to be used somewhere, and people said that, look, cinemas plus some real estate play makes a lot of sense. They got professional advisors in, and in about 10 years, they were the number 2 operator in India. They very quickly realized that, look, acquiring Fame would make them the number 1 operator in India, specifically in a state like Maharashtra, where there is high disposable income. So, in some parts of Maharashtra, not throughout. Also, it gave them some skills. So it was building scale, but it was also skills. Fame had essentially a business which focused on food courts and management, as well as, and Inox lacked that. And the real money, apparently, when you do some of these deals, is in the food, less so in the movies. So, so that was, that was bidder 1, and then bidder 2 was Big Cinemas, and Big Cinemas is was at that point in time the largest cinema chain in India. Of course, owned by Mr. Anil Ambani. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the Ambani family. Some signs of recognition in the room, but essentially, the Ambani group, Mr. Anil Ambani's father, Dhirubhai Ambani, was India's richest man. The group was worth, maybe close to $50 billion. And Anil Ambani was, of course, much bigger as a bidder as compared to Inox. They could have bought Inox if they wanted to, and we'll cover it later in the presentation. But during the hostilities that broke out, there was talk that look, if the Ambanis really get beef, they might just buy it, all of Inox. But interesting, even then they, I think, had a very early joint venture with DreamWorks Studios, and by 2010, as I said, they were the largest. They operated 242 screens. So, what happens next? Just we'll give you some timelines, and if you have any questions while I give you the timelines, because I put in some questions there and some comments there, please feel free to interrupt. Discussions between the Shroffs and the Jains started in 2009, and they took about 6 months until early 2010. And interestingly, unknown to the Jains, each time Mr. Shroff had a discussion with them, he'd have a personal dialogue with Mr. Anil Ambani on the sidelines to do a very similar transaction. The price obviously moved up because some people were obviously in the know, and in that 6-month period, the price moved up 30%. Funnily enough, no regulator investigated it, and who did those transactions. Interestingly, no NDA, no exclusivity, no disclosure was made at that point in time, and it's quite odd when you think about it, because quite often the people who are promoter shareholders are also directors, but they don't inform the board that there is a potential offer that is taking place. So that was slightly I found that's quite interesting, and that's quite interesting on Indian deals. What happens is that while they're taking their time and having cups of tea, negotiating what might be a proper offer, the Shroff suddenly realized that the FCCBs that they had issued, there were certain payments due on those FCCBs. There was a cash crunch. Now, that's where things get a little interesting, because what seems to be an innocuous financing transaction, the Shroffs decide that, look, we can take some leverage from Inox and essentially use that for our current cash crunch. And they don't want to disclose that to the market, because if they disclose that they're actually borrowing and promoters are borrowing, and if they have to disclose it and they have to encumber their shares in the listed target, what happens in Indian exchanges is that the price of those shares starts to fall. So to prop up the share price, they don't disclose it. But Inox, which gave the loan, interestingly, insisted on creating a negative lien, and we, if we have time, we'll talk about what that is. But essentially, they forced the Shroffs to put their shares, essentially in a depository account where the shares could be freely traded. But then gave instructions to the depository that for any transfer of those shares or creating any interest in those shares, you need Inox's consent, and thereby created a soft kind of a security. I wouldn't call it. So high risk, because it required the consent of one individual who is like a nominee of Inox, and effectively saying that, look, to operate this account, you need the instructions of 3 parties, A, B, and C, and C was effectively like an Inox man. But again, no disclosure made at that point in time, and then what happens is that Inox suddenly realizes that, hang on a second, we're not an equity buyer in this transaction, we're just a financier. That the deal is actually going to slip through our hands, it's going to go to somebody else. They're actually negotiating with Reliance to get a much better price. And they exert a lot of pressure on the Shroffs, on Fame. They essentially threaten them with litigation and the fact that, look, the shares will all get encumbered because there'll be litigation all around. You will not be able to transfer your shares. The clock which is ticking, the alarm will now go off. Your FCCBs will come up for redemption, and there'll be dilution all around. So we might lose a little bit of money in terms of the loan value, but you'll lose a lot. The threat pays off. There is, on one fine day in early Feb, there is a block deal that takes place on the market at 44 rupees a share, and Inox actually buys 43% of the company Simultaneously, sort of a day or two later, they announced that they've done a block acquisition on the exchange of a further 7% at 50 rupees a share. So you've got the initial trade at 44 rupees a share, 43% at 44 rupees a share, and then you have another 7% odd at 50 rupees a share. And they decide to give, throw some crumbs to the minorities by giving 51 rupees a share as the offer price, because they have to now, under Indian law, make a mandatory offer. Under Indian law, if you cross 15%, as it was then, you had to make a mandatory offer. So I'll try and speed it up a bit because I see we're coming at the to 25 minutes. So Anand Ambani Group makes a competing offer. It waits a while. It needs to get some basic information out there. Filing, completing the offer documents in India is a tedious process. You need a lot of information, but it makes the competing offer at 83 rupees a share, so almost double, and announces that during this time it's already bought 12% of the company. It's quite interesting because you had disclosures at different thresholds, but it just makes an outright announcement of 12%. So Inox has to react, and what happened under the Indian Takeover Code back then, it was a flaw, and it's been remedied. We'll tell you how. Inox had the ability to actually appoint directors, notwithstanding the fact that there was a competing bid. But the way that law was drafted, the competing bidder wasn't given that opportunity. It was just a loophole. It was an anomaly. So Inox deposited 100% of the open offer consideration at 51 rupees a share into escrow, got certification, and appointed someone on the board. Now, they appointed a gentleman called Mr. Kishore Biani on the board. Mr. Biani runs, Future Group, and funnily enough, he's on the Inox board as an independent director, but he was on the board of Fame, essentially as a representative of Inox. So again, that was quite interesting that actually an independent became effectively a nominee. So Reliance has very limited options at that stage. It does what Mr. Who's the DCM promoter? He does what the DCM guys wanted to do, which is go to the regulator, complain, kick up a storm, and he throws basically the regulatory kitchen sink on Inox and its promoters. He says that, look, minorities have been prejudiced. How could the promoters have sold at a value of 44 rupees a share when I'm willing to offer 83? And wants the regulator to intervene and undo the deal. And it's at that point in time that people thought that, look, will Mr. Ambani actually want this asset so badly that he'll go after Inox. Inox actually held its entertainment business through a separate listed entity. Anyhow, the regulator, acted with fairly promptly. It let Inox's offer go through, and ultimately, Inox succeeded in obtaining control. And finally, what Inox did was it merged Fame, the target company, into its listed company, and that merger process itself took about 2 odd years to complete. And Mr. Ambani now has about 6% in that company. So, what were some of the things that came out of that transaction? The first one was that this negative lien concept was very aggressively legislated by the regulator. They essentially said that, look, a negative lien, call it what you will, it's an encumbrance, you have to disclose it. And the second was that the anomaly that, look, board representation for a competing bidder is permissible if the bidder also agrees to deposit 100% of the consideration. The third bit, which is not on this slide, is the fact that non-compete fees was payable. You could pay selectively to some classes of shareholders, but not all. And that was specifically allowed under the Indian Takeover Code. Up to 20% of the offer price could be paid to controlling shareholders as a non-compete fee. Some portion was paid in this deal, but that rule has now been amended. So now it has to be equal treatment of all shareholders, thankfully. So that was a direct consequence of this transaction. Some quick points of interest. The point that I made to you earlier, on disclosure. Stock exchanges write very regularly because the Indian media is quite strong. Regularly to companies saying, look, are you in discussions with someone? And I've virtually printed the response that we write for targets and for promoters who are in discussions, that we engage in exploratory discussions all the time. I think where the regulatory setup fails is that it doesn't actually see through and ask people for more substantive information, or put them into some sort of a period where they can't trade if they've made a clarification or a public clarification saying that we're not in discussions. So that's completely lacking. The other point that I mentioned to you earlier is, it's curious that how controlling shareholders have when their directors have no fiduciary duty to disclose to the board that there has been an approach. It's not been tested in India, but I think it certainly at some point of time it should be. And the fact that the board is responding to a regulatory inquiry when discussions are taking place at shareholder level itself, to my mind, is curious. But there you go. Some question, just very quickly on soft devices. People have come up with ingenious ways to now raise financing since the definition of encumbrance was widened. There have been models where Western financiers have put in a lot of money into Indian companies by just a simple restriction on transfer of an underlying security, backed by a power of attorney that gives you the right to sell that security. And if you think about it, as a lawyer, it's quite interesting, because the donee of that power is an individual. So if he's hit by a bus, how will that power of attorney be effective? Quite often these documents are left undated and with a trusted confidant of both the lender and the borrower. And again, you have issues, because if the document is signed by someone who's a director today, but he's stripped of his powers tomorrow, he resigns, that instrument might not be effective. So again, some interesting devices. If you ever do India deals, you'll come across them. Delisting in India, again, on hostile deals. Why would you do a hostile deal if you can't get 100%? In India, it's completely ineffective in terms of implementing a delisting and a squeeze out. Essentially, you can't squeeze out minority shareholders in India. I'll make two quick points on this slide, just to keeping an eye on the watch. The first one is, how would things play out differently if Inox repeated itself today? I think the board would be under much more strain now. When the Indian Takeover Code was amended, boards now have to make a recommendation through a direct committee of independent directors, and the recommendation has to be published. If you sync that with class action lawsuits, which have now been recognized expressly under the Indian Companies Act, and allow the people who are bringing the class action lawsuit to not only go after the directors, but also go after the experts who advise them, I think it will bring about a degree of caution. The sad part is the court that's actually meant to implement all of this is not in place. That's stuck in the Supreme Court, and I think some of my friends know how long that might take to resolve. But those are interesting trends which we're seeing. So Rishi, talk a little bit about some of the defenses that exist and how they correlate to the Indian context.
Yeah, so just trying to give you an idea of, given that in America there's so many in hostile deals, you see all sorts of variants of each of these. Just a flavor of what the defenses could be in India. The broad point here is that these operate and they exist, but not in the manner and in the mode that they are known here. And also they serve different purposes. They're not always as defenses to takeovers as they are for other purposes. So quickly, staggered boards. So India by law mandates very often to have staggered boards, but the risk and the reason why it fails as a defense is because the boards themselves, when directors are asked to leave or thrown out, they can very easily approach court, and that results in a lot of litigation, which is very prolonged, and therefore really you can't get rid of a director if he wants to hang around, right? Poison pills, Indian pricing guidelines don't allow you to be able to buy a substantial portion at a price which is far lower than market price. So there's a 2-week average and things like that. So that's why that doesn't really work. Now, so entrenchment, right? Entrenchment is a hot topic with the New Companies Act, which came in 2013. What they do really is, there are mechanisms whereby control can be restricted. Now, for example, if you read about this recent deal with a famous airline in India called the Jet Airways, so Jet and Etihad tied up, and the Indian regulator saw negative control, right? The ability of Etihad to be able to put an end or to stop something the Jet wanted as control. So there are innovative ways where the wording of the articles of a company are put in to ensure that there's some degree of control, which is a way you can prevent a deal if it ever comes through. White knights. So there are a couple of examples where we've seen white knights. So we've seen the Mahindra Group coming in and saving a real estate firm. We've seen Reliance. So Mukesh Ambani stepping in and saving a big hotel chain called the Oberoi Group from another competing consumer market company, ITC. So that's one. And then of course contractual restrictions. So we've seen, for example, the Tata Group, or recently the Jindal Group, which is another big steel manufacturer. These are companies that have tied in their brands and the value assigned to their brands into different structures, which they've protected, and by protecting those in structures outside their company, they ensure that those are not transferred if a deal comes through. But really, that's a cash extraction mechanism. They, at a deal, they'd be able to extract a higher price, and not really a takeover defense. But that's just an overview of some of the things that exist and the manner in which they exist. So.
Okay, and then just very quickly to conclude. I think I'll just go straight into a couple of points on this slide. I think the first one is things are changing, and changing quite rapidly. The advent of investor advisory firms and proxy firms in India is, I think, having a huge impact. I've put up two case studies. One was where Maruti Suzuki, which is a joint venture between essentially Suzuki Motor Corporation of Japan and Maruti in India, was coming up with a new model. What was decided by the board without turning it to shareholders was that the vehicles would be manufactured by Suzuki, and then there'd be a transfer pricing regime between Suzuki and Maruti, which would then essentially brand them and market them. And shareholders, essentially proxy advisory firms, came in. They advocated vociferously against that kind of a resolution without it getting shareholder approval. Apparently it went to shareholders, and the management is confident that it will be approved, but in any case, it was a vindication of shareholders exercising their rights and exercising some scrutiny. In Akzo Nobel, again, similar situation. You had a listed company of Akzo Nobel, which had minority shareholders. You had three unlisted companies, which are wholly owned by Akzo Nobel. And the idea was to merge the three unlisted companies with a huge amount of negative net worth into the listed entity, so that the debt would be then split with the minority shareholders. And again, the management took it to shareholders. Management won the vote. About 23% of the people voted against the resolution, which was statistically quite high. But a number of the large mutual funds and pension funds actually abstained from voting, which people have often described as being quite tragic, because you'd expect these people to be a bit more professional about how they vote. Maybe not in this context, but generally. Quite often, if you study how mutual funds vote, India has passed a law where mutual funds now have to disclose their voting patterns. They generally abstain from voting. So that change, I think, and we're just seeing the green shoots of that change, will have some impact. The second is venture capital-backed IPOs, and I think India has its own version of Alibaba. It's called Snapdeal. Lots of investors have come into Snapdeal. And when you see, and in terms of filings, I mean, our capital markets team right now is, working, 24/7. Indian capital markets are doing extremely well at the moment. There's a lot of positive sentiment about India. A number of the IPOs that we're working on now have had a series of investors come in, which obviously means that the original founders have been diluted. And I think we're having discussions with the securities regulator about whether you can actually list a company without having a defined individual as a promoter, because you have these cases where people have shareholding less than 25% because everybody's diluted. And I think that's another interesting trend, because hopefully it will bring about IPOs of the nature that happen here, where you don't have a very strong vested interest group holding on to power for generations to come. So I think hopefully that gives you some sense of the cultural considerations and economic considerations that have been underlying what we've been doing in India. So thank you.
So the floor is open. I'll start with a question, because I apologize. I actually have some of my students in here. I'm going to have to sneak out and get ready for my smart students who are coming to my class. But here's a question that I have. A lot of the subtext of your story is really the dominance of the promoter-driven companies. And I mean, there's a few of them, and we could all name them: the Ambanis, the Tatas, the Jindals, the Mahindras, and so long as they exercise such a dominant role in the economy, how easy will it ever be to get to what the takeover idea, the hostile takeover market was supposed to do, which was to kind of free up capital, to make capital move to its most efficient uses, to get rid of entrenched management, et cetera. And I just wonder how you see this sitting where you are, and we won't, there's a cone of silence here, so we won't talk about any clients you may particularly have, but how you see those two things working together.
I see it changing, David. I stick my neck out and say that I see it changing simply because, again, I won't name anyone, but we were doing a joint venture for an Indian client, which was a listed entity, with another, entering into a joint venture with a foreign defense manufacturer. And when we investigated our client's ownership, it was 22% of a listed company. Now, if you want to control, an enterprise which is, several $1 billion with a 22% ownership stake, and you think that, look, you can do that in perpetuity, I think you're mistaken. I think there will be Chinese money, Korean money, Russian money, apart from money from the West coming in, which will challenge some of those ownership structures. And I think as asset management companies and Western asset managers come in who are only interested in IRR and not the next board meeting where you're served better quality biscuits or whatever, I think that will change. I think those asset managers will set out, and families are recognizing that. They're recognizing that.
Very interesting. Please.
I have a question.
Sure.
You kind of went on with the entertainment industry and the DCM and so on, but India has a large consumer industry, which is food, construction, housing. So how are they being affected by this transition or monopolization or lack of monopolization? The so-called low middle class, where
I think I think one of the considerations I actually jumped, but it's an important point for for people to know. India's antitrust regulator started in 2009, and they've gone after some big names. There was a large fine against DLF, which is one of the most prominent developers in India. They virtually single-handedly created a satellite city of Delhi called Gurgaon, this satellite city. And they've gone after the cement cartel. It's been a very long established cartel in India. Again, I won't want to name anybody, but they've announced again a fine of about I think $1 billion. The maximum penalty that the CCI can award is $5 billion. So they've awarded a fine of in aggregate split across I think 15 or 16 cement manufacturers of about $1 billion. So I think interestingly what's happening is Indian companies never operated under a regime where there was a strong antitrust law or a strong tort law. And certainly one of those pillars, has now come about. And I think that they are, undertaking some serious investigations. The CCI will announce, the first divestitures, mandatory divestitures will be announced now in one of the large deal situations that we're involved in. I won't name the sector; I'll give it away. And then following that, there's another situation where the first divestitures will be allowed. So I think what's happening is, at a macroeconomic level, this regulator is making its presence felt, and I think over time it will be good for consumer welfare and consumer surplus. Please.
Yeah, following this question, you didn't really talk very much about the kinds of mergers and acquisitions have to be approved in the United States. This is the case in India, I presume, based on.
Yeah,
so the question, the antitrust considerations come into play. Is it considered, for example, is the consideration that the merger and acquisition would result in increased price gouging capabilities?
Yeah.
Does that militate against the approval of such a merger and acquisition or not? That's
yeah. So you know, when the Inox-Fame transaction took place, as I said, you know, India did not have a merger control regulator at that stage. So it actually took place. India's antitrust regulator started in 2009, and for the first 3 years of its existence, all it regulated was dominance and anti-competitive behavior. It was not actually overseeing filing requirements of transactions in terms of a phase 1 and a classic phase 2. That has started now. And again, you know, things are at a very nascent stage. So the first phase 2 filing was made very recently in the case of a pharma transaction, a large pharma transaction which was announced, and you know, the threshold in terms of where the CCI would investigate and maybe order divestitures in terms of dominance is quite high. I think it's 50% plus, certainly.
And if I could follow up very briefly, have there been any approvals of intersectoral, so-called horizontal mergers and acquisitions for the purposes of achieving, you know, of maintaining losing enterprises and lowering prices and even raising salaries? If you see what I'm.
Yeah, it's just building scale, you mean?
I don't know the word.
Right. Well, you know, I mean, certainly there have been instances of horizontal mergers being allowed. You know, if you look at, for example, Network 18 was a large media player, and it bought a regional player called Inadu TV. And Inadu TV was, you know, again, Network 18 was basically dominated by channels which were in Hindi, which is, you know, predominant language of the north, and English. And Inadu TV was, you know, down south in states like Andhra and Orissa, which are sort of southern India, coastal states in the east. And the regulator looked at, you know, dominance in each sort of language and in each region, and ultimately came to the conclusion that, look, they'd allow Network 18 to go ahead and buy that. But that was one instance, certainly, that I can recall of horizontal being cleared. So far, the CCI has actually not blocked anything completely. As I said, divestitures possibly on the cards very soon. And the CCI follows an interesting process in terms of a phase 1 and a phase 2. And in its initial formative phase, I think the CCI's main agenda has been, can we be perceived to be an investor-friendly, business-friendly regulator that doesn't hold up things? Because the biggest fear that we had as M&A lawyers and that investors had is, the minute you make a filing with the CCI, India's timetable goes off scale because they'll never come back in time, and the deal's lost. So at least they worked on that problem, which I think was the real fundamental gating problem that they were working with on. So it's not the question that you were really at, but I think that was the you know, in their formative years, that's what they were legislating for.
So in the United States, we've had Hart-Scott-Rodino for a long time, right? Do you have a similar pre-filing
pre-filing
that almost acts as a deterrent in the United States for some companies to merge because they don't want to pay that enormous fee?
That's right. And so, you know, what we, I mean, very interestingly, again, you know, what happened in one such case is in Thomas Cook case. Thomas Cook was a listed company in India. There was a large deal in terms of large M&A deal, part of a global deal, and prior to filing with the CCI, the acquirer actually started doing some stake building. And although we thought the securities regulator would actually react firmly and say that, look, you know, what is, is this stake building really kosher when you intended to go ahead and acquire the whole thing? But the SEBI never wrote back to them. The CCI jumped in and said that, look, this is gun jumping because you've gone ahead and acquired shares and actually consummated the deal before getting our clearance within the 30-day phase 1 period. So they cleared it ultimately, but they slapped a penalty of about $250,000 for gun jumping. So you know, again, it's early days for antitrust, the antitrust overlay on M&A. But you're seeing some interesting activity, and I think it's going to grow because hopefully if deals grow and situations become more complicated, then it'll grow as well.
Any other questions? Nick, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just curious. You've been describing all these kind of corporate reforms that have been happening, the introduction of competition commissions, and I'm curious how these big dominant families view these reforms and how you would characterize that. Do they view this in their interest because they think they can bring in more revenue, value, or do they see this as a threat to kind of how they've been operating for?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
I don't know if you can answer that succinctly, but or I know if you don't disclose.
No, I think people didn't. To be honest, another regulator has always been.
Did they not see this coming?
No, I think most people, so if you ask me, I was very cynical. I never believed that the new Indian Companies Act would come, or that the Competition Commission would come, or that it would do a decent job, or it would understand what it needs to do. I've been proven wrong. I'm really happy to admit, clearly wrong. They have, if you look at the statistics of the Competition Commission, and I attended, some ABA antitrust seminar in DC, earlier this year, and the statistics were great. They've done a great job in terms of, clearing deals and things like that. So I think initial reaction was always suspicion. One more regulator, someone else who's going to have a big stick to beat us up with. I think people in India are pleasantly surprised by at least the Competition Commission. I think when it comes to SEBI, it's less free of influence from the big boys. And my view is that Indian businesses managed to exert enough influence on the policy direction of SEBI, but less so on the Competition Commission side. Maybe it's too early. So let's hope it stays clean and nimble and focused. But SEBI can do a lot more, if you ask me, to promote M&A and to promote a more equitable securities market, which it doesn't do.
My question is, how well are the regulators? Because there are too many regulators now. There is always a problem, we've heard of it, of over-regulation in the Indian economy. So are the regulators doing a good job not stepping into each other's jurisdiction? Because that is somehow a problem, I believe, in the Indian economy.
Can I just have a quick follow-up question on that? Specifically when you're talking about competition issues, the Competition Commission of India, there's always that possibility of intersectoral conflict.
Yeah.
So in that case, do you see that the Competition Commission is taking cue from the other regulators, asking for the suggestions, and then coming up with its own sets of solutions?
Yeah. So interestingly, because because of the federal structure of India and some of these sectoral regulators that have come up. One of their mandates, and in all the acts that creates these regulators, their price protection and ensuring consumer welfare is always a mandate. And it kind of then there is that overlap with the Competition Commission. I think under the Competition Act, and again, I'm not a competition law specialist, but under the Competition Act, there is a very clear mandate that look, if the Commission makes an order, then it's binding on all other regulators. So now. Having a provision in the Act or a part in the Act in India is one thing. Having sectoral regulators that actually follow it is another, because very often in India the largest litigation is government against government. So I think so far there have been very few instances of the CCI being in open and direct conflict with another sectoral regulator. And in fact what's happened is that once the CCI has given its clearance, it's kind of a smile and a nod for other regulators to clear. So you've seen it in cases like pharma, for example, where foreign investment into pharma companies in India, the first port of call from a regulatory standpoint is, look, will there be a squeeze on the price of Indian generic drugs? And if it's clear from a CCI perspective, they put conditions in terms of continuity of drugs and pricing, etc. Then chances are the drug controller will approve it, and you can go ahead. So I think aviation as well, when there've been some deals in aviation. But I'm sure those conflicts will come. I think it's still early days. It's part of the process. Yeah, those will come. But so far there hasn't been anything which shows that look, there's been a spanner in the works. Things have broken down. So far it's been okay.
Any other questions? Bharat, thank you so much. Khaitan, thank you so much.
Thank you.